Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. September 12, 1683. As the sun rose over Vienna, it revealed a sight that would decide the fate of an entire continent. At the shattered gates of the Habsburg capital stood nearly 200,000 Ottoman soldiers, their cannons finally silent after 2 relentless months of bombardment. Inside the battered walls, barely 11,000 exhausted defenders prepared for what they believed would be their final stand. But beyond the city, on the wooded hills to the northwest, something unexpected was stirring, something the Sultan's armies had failed to foresee. The largest relief force ever assembled in Christian Europe was about to descend upon the Ottoman camp like a gathering storm. What followed would not merely decide a battle, it would end Ottoman expansion into Europe forever and shift the balance of global power for centuries. This is the story of the Battle of Vienna. The day history turned, you rewatching Crimson Legacy Historians. To understand why 2 empires collided at Vienna's gates, we must journey back to the early 17th century, a time when the Ottoman Empire stood as the most powerful state on earth. From the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, from North Africa to the Caucasus Mountains, the Sultan ruled a domain that stretched across 3 continents. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans had known almost nothing but expansion. For 2 centuries, victory followed victory, and their military machine became the most feared force in the known world. At its core stood something Europe could not match: a professional standing army capable of campaigning year after year without disbanding. At the heart of this army were the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps unlike anything Europe had ever fielded. These were not nobles dabbling in warfare, nor peasants forced into service. They were the Sultan's own soldiers, taken as boys from Christian families through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood for war. By 1683, nearly 50,000 Janissaries served the empire. Each was a lifelong professional, loyal only to the Sultan. A veteran named Mustafa would later write, "We were the Sultan's sons, and he was our father. The musket was our mother, gunpowder our milk. We knew no other family but our regiment." Their weapon was the tufek, the Ottoman matchlock musket. Nearly 4 feet long, it fired a heavy lead ball capable of punching through armor at close range. Loading required calm discipline, powder measured, ball wrapped, rammed, primed, and ignited by a burning match cord. In practiced hands, a Janissary could fire 2 to 3 shots per minute. When thousands fired in volleys, witnesses said it sounded like endless thunder rolling across the earth. Yet the Janissaries were only one part of the Ottoman war machine. The empire's striking arm was the Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen granted land in exchange for military service. Unlike Europe's heavily armored knights, the Sipahi favored speed and maneuverability. They wore lighter armor of chain or leather and carried a deadly combination of composite bow, curved Kilish sword and lance. Their bows were masterpieces of engineering, made from wood, horn, and sinew, capable of piercing chainmail at over 200 paces. A skilled Sipahi could fire accurately at full gallop, guiding his horse with his knees alone, striking from angles his enemies never anticipated. In 1683, roughly 40,000 Sipahi cavalry answered the Sultan's call. Supporting them came vast numbers of irregular troops, the Azaps and Akinci, drawn from Anatolia and the Balkans. Armed with whatever weapons they owned, they served as scouts, skirmishers, and the brutal first wave of assaults. And then there was the true terror of Ottoman warfare: artillery. The Ottomans had mastered siege warfare during the fall of Constantinople, when massive cannons shattered walls that had stood for 1,000 years. By 1683, their siege trains included hundreds of guns. The largest bombards fired stone or iron balls weighing up to 300 pounds. Loading one could take hours. When fired, the explosion echoed for miles, tearing chunks from city walls with a single strike. Smaller cannons provided faster, relentless fire. Against fortifications and troop formations, one Ottoman gunner recorded, "The earth itself trembled when our great guns spoke. Walls built by Roman emperors crumbled like sand before our iron thunder. This overwhelming force was assembled by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Sultan's chief minister, a man driven by ambition and dreams of conquest. He convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that the time had come. The Habsburgs were weak, France distracted them in the west. Vienna, he claimed, would fall like ripe fruit, and Vienna was no ordinary prize. Control Vienna, and you controlled the Danube River, the lifeline of Central Europe. Control Vienna, and the German states lay open. Control Vienna, and the Sultan could dictate terms to Christian rulers from Poland to the Atlantic. Emperor Leopold I understood this perfectly. Vienna was not just his capital, it was Europe's shield. In March 1683, Kara Mustafa Pasha led his army out of Adrianople. Contemporary sources differ, but most estimates place his force at staggering numbers, around 40,000 Janissaries, 40,000 Sipahi, 20 to 30,000 Crimean Tatars, and 70,000 to 80,000 provincial troops, laborers, and camp followers. This meant the total Ottoman host that marched on Vienna numbered somewhere between 170,000 and 200,000 souls. The columns stretched for miles, a moving city of soldiers, horses, camels, oxen-drawn wagons, and siege equipment. The march took months. The army moved northwest through Ottoman territories in the Balkans Sea, crossed into Hungary, and advanced up the Danube Valley toward Vienna. Habsburg scouts tracked their progress with growing alarm, sending rider after desperate rider to Vienna with reports of the Ottoman numbers. Emperor Leopold faced an impossible choice. He could not possibly defend Vienna with the forces he had immediately available. The Habsburg standing army numbered only about 30,000 men, and many of those were scattered across the empire, dealing with other threats on July 7th. Emperor Leopold made the decision music that would save his dynasty but haunt his conscience. He abandoned Vienna, taking his court, his treasury, and his family. Leopold fled west to Passau, music then to Linz, leaving the defense of his capital to Count Ernst Rütiger von Arenberg. The military governor of Vienna, Starberg, was a professional soldier, 52 years old, scarred from decades of warfare against the Ottomans. He was given command of the city's garrison, which numbered approximately 11,000 soldiers after Leopold's departure, plus an additional 5,000 armed civilians who volunteered to help defend their homes. A merchant named Andreas recorded his thoughts as the emperor's procession left the city. "I watched our emperor ride away, and I confess my heart filled with despair. How could we, common men, hold back the entire might of the East? My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my musket. But then I looked at the walls our grandfathers built, and I thought of my wife and children shelt, airing the cellars below. If we must die, let it be here, protecting everything we hold dear." Starberg set his men to work strengthening Vienna's fortifications. The city's walls had been rebuilt in the modern style after an earlier Ottoman siege in 1529. Instead of the old vertical walls that artillery could easily breach, Vienna now possessed what military engineers called a trace Italian, a star-shaped system of low, thick walls with projecting bastions that could catch attackers in crossing fields of fire. The walls themselves were 20 feet tall and up to 20 feet thick in places made of brick faced with stone. In front of the walls ran a deep, dry moat, and beyond that a sloped earthwork called a glacus, designed to expose attacking troops to defensive fire. But Starberg knew these defenses, formidable as they were, would not hold indefinitely against Ottoman siege expertise. He needed time. Time for help to arrive, time for the relief force that Emperor Leopold had promised to send. So Starberg's men tore down buildings outside the walls to clear fields of fire, filled the city storerooms with grain and gunpowder, and positioned their artillery. Vienna's garrison possessed approximately 300 cannons of various sizes, mostly bronze pieces, firing balls of 6 to 24 lb. These guns were distributed along the bastions and walls, each crew trained to fire at approaching enemy troops and counter battery fire at Ottoman siege positions. The defenders carried an assortment of weapons: irregular infantry, Mostly German and Austrian troops in Habsburg service used matchlock muskets similar to the Ottoman Tuff, though the imperial musket, the arquebuse, was slightly longer and fired a heavier ball. Like their Ottoman counterparts, these soldiers went through the laborious loading process for each shot: powder, ball, ram, prime, blow on the match, aim, pull the trigger. Elite units carried the newer flintlock muskets, which used a piece of flint-striking steel to create sparks instead of a burning match cord. Flintlocks were more reliable in wet weather and faster to ready, but they were expensive and not yet standard issue. For close-quarters fighting, the defenders relied on pikes, swords, and halberds. The pike, an 18-feet wooden shaft tipped with a steel point, was the primary defense against cavalry charges. Pikemen trained to present a wall of points that no horse would willingly charge into. When Ottoman troops breached the walls or broke into the city's outworks, the fighting came down to cold steel, the slash of sabers, the thrust of swords, the brutal work of axes and hammers, crushing armor and bone. On July 14th, the Ottoman vanguard appeared on the hills south of Vienna. The main army arrived throughout the following days until the entire Ottoman host surrounded the city on three sides, with only the north bank of the Danube remaining open. Khan Mustafa established his magnificent command tent, a pavilion of silk and gold on a hill with a clear view of Vienna's walls. From this position, Clear's throat, he directed the siege operations with confidence bordering on certainty. Vienna would fall. It was only a matter of time. The Ottoman siege strategy relied on proven methods rather than attempting to take the walls by direct assault, which would cost thousands of lives. Khan Mustafa ordered his engineers to begin digging. This was the science of siege warfare, and the Ottomans were masters of it. They dug zigzag trenches called saps, approaching the walls in a pattern that protected the diggers from defensive fire. Music. As the trenches grew closer, Ottoman miners began tunneling underground music directly beneath Vienna's walls and bastions. Their goal was to plant massive charges of gunpowder in chambers carved under the foundations, then detonate them to bring down entire sections of wall. Simultaneously, the Ottoman artillery opened fire. The great bombards positioned in fortified batteries began hurling their enormous projectiles at Vienna's defenses. Music, the smaller cannon, maintained a more rapid fire, preventing the defenders from repairing damage and forcing them to keep their heads down. The sound was ceaseless day and night, a rolling thunder that never stopped. Stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds smashed into walls, creating clouds of pulverized brick and stone. Iron balls heated red-hot, and fires were fired into the city to start conflagrations that burned entire neighborhoods. A young soldier named Johann wrote to his sister a letter that was never sent. Found in the rubble weeks later, "You cannot imagine the sound, dear sister. It never stops, not even for a moment. The crash of the cannon, the whistle of falling shot, the screams of the wounded. I have not slept more than an hour at a time in weeks. We dig in the rubble by day, trying to repair what the Turkish guns destroy, and we fight in the darkness by night when their miners break into our counter-tunnels. Yesterday, I killed a man with my bare hands in a tunnel no wider than a coffin. Music. His face haunts me, but we do not surrender. We cannot. If Vienna falls, where will you run? Where will any of us be safe?" The garrison fought back with desperate ingenuity. Starberg organized teams of counterminers who dug their own tunnels, trying to intercept the Ottoman mine shafts before they could reach the walls. When these tunnels intersected, brutal underground battles erupted in pitch darkness, men fighting with knives and pistols in spaces so cramped they could barely move. Both sides used a terrifying weapon in these subterranean wars: music, the hand grenade. These were hollow iron spheres filled with gunpowder and scrap metal with a fuse sticking out the top. A soldier would light the fuse with his match cord, count to 3, and hurl it at the enemy. The explosion in a Clear's throat confined tunnel was devastating. Music sending lethal fragments in all directions and often collapsing the tunnel. Music, burying everyone inside. Above ground, the defenders used their cannon to target Ottoman siege works, music and artillery positions. They fired solid shot to knock down the earthwork barriers protecting Ottoman guns, and they fired chain shot two balls connected by a length of chain that tumbled through the air and was devastating against troops in the open. When Ottoman soldiers masked for an assault, the defenders loaded their cannon with canister shot, turning each gun into a giant shotgun that fired hundreds of musket balls in a spreading cone of death. Despite all this, the Ottoman siege crept inexorably forward. By early August, sections of Vienna's outer fortifications had been badly damaged by artillery fire and mine explosions. The bastions protecting the Berg and Lobel positions showed dangerous cracks. On August 12th, a massive Ottoman mine exploded under the Berg Ravelin and outer defensive work. The blast threw earth and stone hundreds of feet into the air and opened a breach in the fortifications. Ottoman assault troops, Janissaries in their distinctive white felt caps and robes, charged into the gap with terrible war cries. The fighting that followed was savage beyond description. The defenders, exhausted and reduced in number by 2 months of constant combat, met the Janissaries with musket fire, pikes, and raw desperation. Men fought hand-to-hand in the rubble, music slipping on blood, choking on gunpowder smoke so thick you couldn't see 5p. Aces ahead. The Janissaries pushed forward, their tucks barking fire, their scimitars rising and falling. Habsburg pikemen braced their weapons against the assault, the steel points finding gaps in armor. Grenades exploded in blinding flashes. After 3 hours of continuous combat, the defenders managed to drive the Janissaries back and hastily construct a new defensive line behind the breach. But everyone knew this was only temporary. The Ottomans would come again and again. Each time the defenders had fewer men to hold the walls. Casualties mounted daily, disease spread through the overcrowded city, food supplies dwindled despite rationing, gunpowder stocks fell to critical levels. By late August, Starberg estimated he had perhaps 8,000 combat-effective soldiers left, and the Ottoman guns had opened several additional breaches in the walls. Vienna was dying and everyone inside knew it. Where was the relief force? Where was the army that Emperor Leopold had promised? The answer lay in the desperate diplomatic efforts happening across Europe. Leopold's emissaries had traveled to every Christian court, begging for assistance. The Pope blessed the cause and sent money. Several German princes pledged troops, but the largest response came from an unexpected source, Poland. King Jan, the third Sois of Poland, was perhaps the finest military commander of his generation, a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting the Ottomans and Tatars on the vast plains of East. He was 54 years old in 1683, a giant of a man, standing well over 6 trillions tall, with a thick beard and eyes that his contemporaries described as fierce and calculating in equal measure. So I understood that if Vienna fell, Poland would be next. The Ottomans would sweep north through Moravia and into Polish territory, and his kingdom would face the full might of the Ottoman Empire alone. So Sois made his decision. He would march to Vienna with every man he could muster. He brought approximately 18,000 Polish troops, including the force that would decide the battle, the Polish winged Hussars. These heavy cavalry were legendary across Europe, feared and respected in equal measure. The Hussars wore full-plate armor, polished steel that gleamed in the sun, and they carried lances 20 feet long, tipped with steel points. But what made them unforgettable were the wooden frames mounted to the back of their armor, from which sprouted enormous feathers, usually eagle or ostrich plumes, that created a distinctive rushing sound when they charged. The psychological effect on enemy troops was devastating. A Hussar officer named Stanislaw wrote in his memoirs, "We were the pride of Poland, the descendants of knights who had defended Christendom for centuries. Each of us trained from boyhood to fight from horseback, to couch the lance, to strike with perfect timing at full gallop. Our armor could turn aside musk balls and sword strikes. Our horses were bred for strength and courage. When we charged, we were unstoppable, a steel avalanche that broke armies and crushed the spirit of our enemies. The Hussars carried more than lances. Each man had a straight saber, a wieroch or flintlock pistol, and sometimes a battle hammer for close combat. The wieroch pistol was a marvel of 17th century engineering. Using a spinning wheel pressed against a piece of iron pyrite, to create sparks and ignite the powder. These pistols were expensive, but they were reliable and could be carried loaded and ready. Unlike matchlock weapons, a hussar would charge with his lance couched under his arm, aim for the initial impact, then drop the shattered lance and draw his pistol and saber for the close-quarters melee that followed. Joining Sobieski's Poles were German imperial troops under Charles V, Duke of Rhine, who brought approximately 20,000 battle-hardened soldiers. Additional forces arrived from Bavaria, Saxony, Suabia, and Franconia. German states that understood Vienna's fall would leave them exposed. In total, the relief army assembled near Toll, northwest of Vienna, numbered approximately 70,000 men. It was the largest Christian force assembled in Europe in generations, but it was still outnumbered by the Ottoman host surrounding Vienna. Duke Charles of Rhine was an experienced commander, but he deferred to Soy's tactical genius and greater experience fighting the Ottomans. The two men met on September 6 to coordinate their strategy. They faced a desperate situation. Vienna was on the verge of collapse. Intelligence reports from messengers who had managed to slip through Ottoman lines indicated that Starberg had perhaps days left before his ammunition ran out completely, or another major breach forced a final unsuccessful defense. The relief army would have to attack immediately, and they would have to attack in the most difficult circumstances possible. The terrain around Vienna favored the defenders of the siege, not the relief force. The Ottoman army had positioned itself with the city at its back, and the Vienna woods, a range of forested hills protecting its left flank. To reach Vienna, the Christian army would have to march through these hills, emerge onto the plain before the city, and then attack an entrenched enemy that had spent 2 months fortifying its positions. It was a military nightmare, but there was no alternative. On September 8th, the relief army began its approach march. They moved in several columns through the Vienna woods, following narrow forest tracks and mountain paths. This was incredibly dangerous. If the Ottomans discovered them while they were strung out in column, the entire relief force could be destroyed piecemeal. But Sobeys gambled that Khan Mustafa would be so focused on Vienna's final collapse that he wouldn't expect a major attack from the wooded hills. He was partially right. Ottoman scouts did report movement in the Vienna woods, but Khan Mustafa dismissed the reports. He believed the relief force was still days away. He believed Vienna would fall before they could arrive. His attention remained fixed on the city's crumbling defenses, where his miners were preparing what he expected to be the final decisive assault. On September 11th, the relief army completed its march through the Vienna woods and assembled on the Kohlenberg Heights, a ridge of hills overlooking Vienna and the entire Ottoman siege camp. From this vantage point, the Christian commanders could see everything. The sprawling Ottoman encampment with its thousands of tents, the siege lines encircling Vienna, the breaches in the city's walls, and the smoke rising from fires burning inside the doomed city. They could also see that Vienna still flew Habsburg banners, the city still held. They were not too late. That music night, as the relief army made its final preparations, a single cannon shot boomed out from the Kohlenberg Heights. It was a signal to Vienna's garrison that help had arrived. Inside the city, men wept with relief. Starberg immediately ordered his remaining gunpowder to be saved for the next day's battle. They would hold just a little longer. A priest in Vienna recorded, "When we heard that cannon shot echo from the hills, I fell to my knees and thanked God for his mercy. All around me, September 12, 1683, dawned clear and cool. By 6 in the morning, both armies were preparing for battle. The relief force held the high ground of the Kohlenberg and the surrounding hills. They would have to descend the plain to engage the main Ottoman army. So I organized his forces into 3 main divisions. On the left, nearest the Danube, Duke Charles of Lorraine commanded the German imperial troops and contingents from the various German states. In the center, additional German forces under various princes and commanders. On the right, holding the position closest to the Vienna woods, Sobeys placed his Polish army, including the precious winged Hussars. This positioning was deliberate. The right flank had the most room to maneuver, and Sobeys was planning the decisive cavalry charge that would break the Ottoman army. Khan Mustafa faced an agonizing decision. He could continue focusing on Vienna and try to take the city before the relief army attacked, or he could abandon the siege, turn his entire force around, and meet the Christian army in open battle. In perhaps the greatest mistake of his career, he tried to do both. He left a substantial portion of his forces, including many Janissaries, to continue the siege and assault Vienna's walls, while he turned the rest of his army to face the approaching relief force. This divided music his strength at the critical moment and meant the Ottoman army would fight without its full power concentrated in one place. The Ottoman forces that turned to face the relief army consisted primarily of the Sipahi cavalry, the Tatar horsemen, and numerous provincial infantry units. Khan Mustafa positioned his artillery on rising ground to fire at a descending Christian army, and he ordered the Sipahi to prepare for the cavalry battle he expected. His plan was simple. His superior numbers would wear down the Christian forces, his artillery would disrupt their formations, and his cavalry would find a weak point to exploit. The Janissaries would take Vienna, and then his full force would turn on the exhausted relief army and annihilate it. The battle began around 9 in the morning, when the Christian left and centre divisions under Duke Charles of Lorraine began their advance down the slopes toward the Ottoman positions. This was no parade ground march. The troops had to navigate through vineyards, over stone walls, and across irrigation ditches, while under fire from Ottoman artillery. The Ottoman guns, positioned in carefully prepared batteries, began firing as soon as the Christian troops came into range. Bronze cannons belched fire and smoke, sending solid shot bouncing and skipping across the ground, each impact creating fountains of earth and sending lethal fragments in all directions. A German officer named Friedrich described the advance. The Turkish guns opened on us with terrible fury. I saw a cannonball strike the man next to me, simply erasing him from existence. One moment he was there complaining about his sore feet. The next there was only a red mist and pieces falling to the ground. But we could not stop. We could not even slow down. We marched forward through that iron hail because Vienna ended on us, because all of Christendom depended on us. Men fell music at every step, but we closed the ranks and continued forward. As the German forces advanced, they deployed their own artillery. Unlike the Ottomans, who had positioned most of their heavy siege guns facing Vienna, the Christian army had brought lighter field pieces that could be manhandled into position relatively quickly. These 3 and 6 lb guns, called falconets and sakers, fired smaller projectiles but could be moved to support the advancing infantry. Christian gun crews worked with desperate efficiency, loading, firing, reloading, while Ottoman cavalry swept around the flanks trying to overrun the artillery positions. The infantry on both sides opened fire when they came into range. Lines of musketeers on each side loaded and fired as fast as their weapons allowed. The procedure never changed. Pour powder, ram the ball, prime the pan, blow the match. Present fire. The smoke from thousands of muskets created a dense fog that hung over the battlefield, reducing visibility to just a few paces. Men fired into this smoke at shadows and movement, music never knowing if their shots found targets. The sound was indescribable, a continuous roar of musketry punctuated by the deeper boom of cannon. The fighting along this part of the battlefield devolved into a brutal stalemate. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The German troops fought with disciplined courage, their pikemen holding formation to repel cavalry charges music, while their musketeers maintained steady fire. The Ottoman forces, fighting on ground they had occupied for months, and knew intimately, used every ditch, wall and building as cover. The Sipahi cavalry launched repeated charges trying to break the German squares, but each time they were driven back by pike and musket fire. Meanwhile, throughout the morning and into the afternoon, the Polish army under Soys was slowly advancing on the right flank. This movement took hours because of the difficult terrain. The Poles had to move through dense woodlands, across steep ravines, and over rough ground that made it impossible to maintain formation. But Sobieski was patient. He knew that the longer the battle in the center went on, the more Ottoman forces would commit to that fight. He was setting up the decisive blow, and he would not waste it by attacking prematurely. By early afternoon, the battle had been raging for more than 5 hours. The German troops in the center had fought themselves to exhaustion, and while they held their ground, they had not broken through Ottoman defenses. Casualties on both sides mounted into the thousands. The smoke, the heat, the deafening noise, the constant proximity to death, all of it wore down even the most veteran soldiers. Men fought mechanically, loading and firing beyond thinking, beyond fear, operating on training and desperation alone. Inside Vienna, Starberg could hear the battle raging outside. To the walls. He knew this was his moment. If the relief force was going to break the siege, Vienna's garrison had to attack from inside to divide Ottoman attention and forces. Despite his men being on the edge of collapse from exhaustion and hunger, Starberg ordered a music sortie. The gates of Vienna opened and several thousand defenders poured out, attacking the Ottoman siege lines from behind. The Janissaries, who had been preparing for yet another assault on Vienna's breaches, suddenly found themselves under attack from their rear. They fought with characteristic discipline and ferocity, but they were caught between hammer and anvil, between the Vienna garrison attacking from the city and the pressure from the relief army attacking from outside. The Janissaries fell back to secondary defensive positions, but their attention was now divided. They could not deliver the final blow to Vienna, and they could not reinforce the main Ottoman army facing the relief force. One Janissary sergeant wrote later, in an account recovered from Ottoman archives, we had been told Vienna would fall that very day. We had prepared our scaling ladders, sharpened our scimitars, loaded our muskets, and then the German dogs came at us from behind. We had not expected the city to still have the strength to attack. We did not know their relief army had arrived. Music, everything went wrong at once. The order came to fall back, but fall back where? Enemies were everywhere. By 4 in the afternoon, Soys judged the moment had come. His Polish troops had completed their flanking maneuver, and now held position on the Ottoman left the army's vulnerable side. Music Karam Mustafa had committed most of his reserves to the fighting in the center and was trying to organize a response to Vienna's sortie. The Ottoman formations were extended, their cavalry dispersed, their attention divided. This was the opening Soys had been waiting for. The Polish king assembled his cavalry for the charge that would decide the battle. Approximately 18,000 horsemen formed up in the rolling terrain north of the Vienna woods, with the elite winged Hussars comprising the spearhead of this formation. 3,000 Hussars formed in the front ranks, their armor gleaming, their lances upright, the distinctive wing frames rising behind them. Behind the Hussars came the rest of the Polish cavalry. Music lighter horsemen called pancerni, wearing chain mail and carrying lances and sabres, and the petty nobility fighting as cavalrymen, each one bringing his own armor and weapons. Soy himself would lead the charge. At 54, an age when most men thought about retirement from active combat, the Polish king took his place at the front of his Hass. He wore full-plate armor, music, polished to a mere finish, and carried a 6-foot lance and a jeweled saber. His horse was a massive charger, bred specifically for the crushing weight of an armored rider at full gallop. Before the charge, Soys addressed his men. Those who heard him reported that he said, "Gentlemen, the hour has come. Before us stands the enemy that has threatened our homes, our faith, our families. Vienna calls to us, Europe calls to us, God himself calls to us. We are the sword of Christendom, and today we strike. Charge with courage, fight with honor, and remember that your children's children will speak of what we do this day." Then he lowered his lance, spurred his horse forward, and the greatest cavalry charge of the 17th century began. The ground trembled as 18,000 horses began to move. The charge started at a walk, the massive formation moving forward with disciplined precision. The Hussars kept their lances upright, their horses in perfect alignment. As they crested a small rise and the full Ottoman army came into view, spread across the plain below. Trumpets sounded the signal to accelerate. The walk became a trot. Hundreds of lances came down simultaneously, a forest of steel points aimed at the enemy. An Ottoman soldier who survived the battle described what he saw. "We heard them before we saw them. A rumbling like distant thunder that grew louder and louder. Then they appeared on the ridge, music, and I swear by Allah, the sun itself seemed dim compared to the gleaming steel of their armor. They came down the slope like an avalanche, and the sound of their charge, The rush of those devil music wings, it froze my blood. I had fought Poles before, but never like this, never so many, never so terrible. The trot became a canter. The canter became a gallop, and at full gallop, with the momentum of tons of armor, horses and men behind each lance point, the winged hussar struck the left flank of the Ottoman army like a thunderbolt. The impact music was catastrophic. Ottoman cavalry formations trying to wield to face this new threat simply disintegrated on contact. Horses went down screaming, men were lifted from their saddles by lance points and thrown to the ground. The hussars broke through the first line of defenders, dropped their shattered lances, drew their sabres and pistols and kept driving forward into the heart of the Ottoman position. Behind them came wave after wave of Polish cavalry, each successive charge adding to the chaos and destruction. The Ottoman left flank buckled, then broke completely. Sipahi cavalry, who had fought with courage all day against the German troops in the center, now found themselves attacked from the side by an enemy they had no formation to resist. The disciplined units dissolved into scattered groups of riders trying to escape or fighting desperate individual combats. The Polish charge swept across the battlefield like wildfire. The momentum was unstoppable. Ottoman infantry units that had held their positions all day against German attacks found themselves ridden down by Polish cavalry that had broken through from an unexpected direction. Artillery batteries, their guns still aimed at the forces in the center, were overrun before the gunners could wield their pieces around. The massive siege guns, the great bombards that had pounded Vienna for 2 months, fell silent as their crews fled or died, fighting hand-to-hand with Polish horsemen. Karam Mustafa tried to organize a counterattack, tried to pull together his reserves and form a new defensive line, music, but events were moving too fast. The Ottoman army was not just being defeated, it was collapsing into panicked rout when soldiers in the center saw the left flank disintegrating and Polish cavalry sweeping around behind them. Unit cohesion evaporated. Men threw down their weapons and ran. What had been an army became a mob of terrified individuals trying to escape. The Janissaries, the elite troops who had fought so hard to take Vienna, now had to fight their way out of the collapsing siege lines. Many units maintained their disciplined music and conducted fighting withdrawals, selling their lives dearly to buy time for others to escape. But even the vaunted Janissaries could not stand against the combined pressure of Vienna's garrison attacking from one side, German imperial troops pushing from another, and Polish cavalry tearing through from yet another direction. By 6 in the evening, less than 2 hours after the Polish charge began, the Battle of Vienna was effectively over. The Ottoman army was in full retreat, streaming south and east away from Vienna, abandoning their camps, their artillery, their supplies, everything that would slow them down. The Christian forces pursued, cutting down fleeing soldiers, capturing thousands of prisoners, seizing unimaginable amounts of booty from the Ottoman encampments. Khan Mustafa managed to escape with his life and a portion of his army, but his dreams of conquest died on the plains before Vienna. He had commanded perhaps the largest and best-equipped Ottoman army ever assembled, and he had seen it destroyed in a single afternoon. The Grand Vizier fled south, knowing that his failure would not be forgiven. He was right. Sultan Mehmed IV, furious at the disaster, ordered Kara Mustafa executed on December 25, 1683. The Grand Vizier was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method for executing high-ranking Ottoman officials in Belgrade. King John Soviet entered Vienna on September 13th to the jubilation of the surviving population. Starenburg, the garrison commander, Music, who had held the city against impossible odds for 2 months, met the Polish king at the gates. The two men embraced, and witnesses reported that both were weeping. Sobieski toured the devastated city. Music saw the breaches in the walls, the burned buildings, the exhausted defenders. Music, and he understood just how close Vienna had come to falling. That evening, Sobies wrote a letter to his wife, Queen Maria Casimir, in which he, Music, paraphrased Julius Caesar's famous words, Vini, vidi, Deus visit, I came, I saw, God conquered. It was not false modesty. Soy genuinely believed that the victory at Vienna was divine intervention, that God had used Christian armies as his instrument to turn back the Ottoman tide. The casualties from the Battle of Vienna were staggering. The Ottoman army lost approximately 15,000 dead on the battlefield and suffered perhaps another 20,000 captured or dead from wounds in the days following the battle. The Christian forces lost around 4,000 killed or mortally wounded, with thousands more suffering injuries. Inside Vienna, the two-month siege had killed approximately 3,000 soldiers and perhaps 10,000 civilians from combat, disease, and starvation. But numbers alone cannot capture the significance of what happened at Vienna. The Ottoman Empire had suffered its most decisive defeat in over a century. The aura music of Ottoman invincibility, carefully cultivated through 200 years of nearly continuous expansion, shattered in a single day. The balance of power in Eastern Europe shifted permanently. More immediately, the defeat at Vienna, triggered what historians call the Great Turkish War, a 16-year conflict in which a coalition of Christian powers, the Holy League formed by the Pope, Austria, Poland, Venice, and eventually Russia, systematically rolled back Ottoman conquests in the Balkans. Armies that had spent centuries on the defensive now went on the offensive. Cities and territories that had been under Ottoman rule for generations were reconquered. By the Treaty of Karloit since 1699, the Ottoman Empire was forced to cede Hungary, Transylvania, and large portions of the Balkans to the Habsburg Empire and its allies. The psychological and cultural impact resonated even further. Vienna became a symbol of Christian resistance, the city that stood firm when all seemed lost. The legend of the winged Hussars grew to mythical proportions. Coffee houses sprang up across Vienna, supposedly started by entrepreneurs using sacks of coffee beans abandoned in the Ottoman camps. The croissant pastry, according to popular legend, though disputed by historians, was created in Vienna to commemorate the victory, its crescent shape mocking the Islamic crescent symbol. Whether these particular stories are true or not, they reflect how deeply the battle embedded itself in European consciousness. For the Ottoman Empire, Vienna marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. The empire would continue to exist for another 240 years until its final dissolution after World War I. But it would never again threaten Central Europe. The dynamic, expanding power that had made Constantinople tremble before Suleiman the Magnificent became gradually and inexorably the sick music man of Europe, struggling to maintain territories rather than conquering new ones, falling further and further behind European powers in technology, military organization, and economic development. The weapons and tactics that clashed at Vienna also represented a turning point in military history. The matchlock muskets that equipped most infantry on both sides were already becoming obsolete.